I let them borrow my car after an emergency. The next week, I saw it painted and re-registered in her name. When I confronted her, my daughter-in-law said, "You gave it to us, get over it." My son said, "We're a team now." I walked away that day, straight to the DMV. What happened next left her in tears when she read. I never thought a car could ruin a family, but that morning in Phoenix, it almost did. I still remember the way my chest tightened when I saw it parked across the street, shining in a brand new coat of metallic teal. My car, my 20-year-old Honda, the one I'd saved up for, polished every weekend, registered in my name for the past 10 years. And now, it wasn't mine anymore. A week ago, my neighbor had called frantic, sobbing about her car breaking down. She begged to borrow mine, said it was an emergency. My instinct was to help, so I gave her the keys without a second thought. I told myself I trusted her. I told myself that family is family and we help each other. Apparently, I was wrong. When I drove by that morning, I noticed the plates weren't just swapped, they were new, and they were hers. Brand new registration, her name listed as the owner. My heart sank. I parked down the block, sitting in my neighbor's old, battered minivan, trying to steady myself. My hands shook. The betrayal was so sharp it felt physical. I didn't go straight to the confrontation. I wanted to be calm. I wanted to reason. But as soon as I knocked on their door, the smile my daughter-in-law gave me was smug, confident, almost gleeful. "You gave it to us," she said before I could even start. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was a statement, like a gavel hitting the bench. "What do you mean, gave it to you?" I snapped, my voice rising despite the knot in my throat. "We're a team now," my son said from the couch, arms crossed, the same lazy smile he'd perfected over the years. "Families share. You wanted to help. You did, get over it." I froze, my throat felt like sandpaper. I wanted to scream, to shake them, to demand justice, but the words wouldn't come. I turned, walked out, each step heavier than the last. I felt like my blood was freezing. The betrayal wasn't just about the car, it was about the principle, about trust, about family lines being crossed. That day I didn't go home. I didn't cry in my car or stew in anger. I drove straight to the DMV. My plan hadn't fully formed yet, but my mind was sharp. I was already calculating the possibilities, scanning the rules, the loopholes, the tiny cracks in the system I could exploit. By the time I left, I had a file folder clutched to my chest. Every form, every legal notice, every ownership record, it was all there. And in my heart, a cold clarity settled in. They thought they'd pulled a fast one on me. They thought I'd roll over. They were wrong. Hours later, when my daughter-in-law opened the mail that arrived at her house, she didn't just cry. She crumpled to the floor, reading the notice I had orchestrated, every letter in black and white perfection. The reality was staring her down like a guillotine. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled, not because I enjoyed her tears, but because justice, finally, was real and mine. But that was only the beginning. What they didn't know, what they had no idea was coming, would make them regret ever touching what was mine, and I would make sure they felt every ounce of it. I'm not the type to hold grudges lightly. I'm methodical, careful, and painfully aware of family dynamics, probably too aware. My son David is 28 now, married to Lindsay for 3 years. I loved Lindsay once. She was bright, ambitious, funny, but somewhere along the way something shifted. I didn't notice it at first. I just assumed family friction was normal. When David first introduced her, I welcomed her like any mother would. I offered her advice, cooked her meals, even lent her my car when she needed it for work or errands. I treated her like family, but small things start to feel off. She'd make passive comments about me not being generous enough or about me not understanding them as a unit. David, who used to be deferential, began parroting her lines, shrugging off my concerns. "We're a team now, Mom," he'd say, every time I tried to draw a line. It sounded innocent at first, but now, with the car stolen from me, I could see the pattern clearly. David and Lindsay have always had a way of turning small favors into permanent assumptions. I remember lending them money once when their water heater broke. I expected repayment. They forgot, and eventually acted like it had never been a loan at all. I chalked it up to their naivety. Big mistake. Lindsay thrives on rewriting narratives. If she wants something, she maneuvers until everyone believes she's entitled. She's subtle, never openly confrontational, but every interaction is a chess move. The car was just another pawn in her game. And David's been under her influence for years, probably longer than he'd admit. Their teamwork isn't just emotional, it's predatory. I've always prided myself on being careful, keeping my life orderly. I keep track of bills, registrations, passwords, everything that belongs to me. But I made the fatal mistake of trusting them with something as simple as a car, something I never thought could be weaponized against me. And that's why walking into the DMV that morning felt like waking up from a nightmare. I knew the system. I knew exactly how to leverage it. It wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine, it was about proving a point, about showing them that trust isn't a tool to be exploited. I kept thinking back to the day I first met Lindsay's family a few years ago and how she had subtly undermined me in front of David, questioning my advice, laughing quietly at my suggestions. I had brushed it off then, but now it all made sense. She doesn't just take, she erases. She rewrites reality until everyone believes her version is true. That's why this revenge can't just be about taking the car back. It has to sting. It has to make them realize that manipulation has consequences. It has to make them feel the loss of control, the vulnerability I felt the moment I saw my own car registered in her name. I spent hours at the DMV that day, filling out forms, checking the legality of every move, ensuring nothing could be reversed. It wasn't impulsive, it was surgical. By the time I left, I had set the wheels in motion for something irreversible, something that would shatter the illusion of teamwork they so smugly wrapped themselves in. And deep down, I knew they had no idea how far I could go. They thought this was a one-time betrayal, a minor bump in family relations. They didn't realize I had a memory like a steel trap and a patience honed over decades. They didn't realize the storm I was quietly engineering while they laughed in their ignorance. Because in the end, it wasn't about the car. It was about respect. And respect, I decided, is earned, or it's enforced. I spent the rest of that week in a blur of legal forms, DMV appointments, and quiet research. Every spare moment, I was on my laptop, tracking titles, registrations, and tax records. I wasn't angry in the way people shout or slam doors. I was calm, precise, a predator in slow motion. By the end of Thursday, I had everything I needed to make my move. If they had any idea what I was capable of, their smug little team would have crumbled weeks ago. It started with small escalations, the kind that seem innocent at first but leave an unmistakable sting. I discovered that when Lindsay and David had transferred the car into her name, they'd cut corners, forgot to update insurance and parking violations. Every violation left unpaid would compound, and every error became a tiny lever I could pull. I flagged them all, scheduled notices, and made sure that every legal paper eventually wound up in her mailbox. By Friday, I had sent notices of late fees, unpaid registration, and a series of DMV alerts they wouldn't even see coming until it was too late. I also started quietly documenting their team behavior. Every conversation where they tried to gaslight me, every offhand comment Lindsay had made about family assets being shared was logged. Not just in my head, written down, time-stamped, typed into a file I could use as evidence if things escalated further. They had no clue I was this meticulous, no idea that the very casual sneer they wore like armor was now fuel for the retaliation that was about to hit them. Then I began testing their boundaries. I drove past their house multiple times, pretending to casually check the neighborhood. Each time I noticed little cracks in their facade. Lindsay's laugh when she thought I wasn't looking, David checking his phone nervously, the way she tensed whenever I waved. The tension was palpable, like they were already starting to feel the shadow of something they couldn't see. And I loved it, not because I wanted to terrorize them, but because finally, they were going to understand that you don't rewrite someone else's life without consequences. That evening I got a call from the DMV clerk, a quiet, official voice that almost made me grin in the car. Every form I had submitted had been processed. The ownership had been frozen, any further transfers suspended, and notices were on their way to their home. By Monday, Lindsay would get the first one. I imagined her reading it, the color draining from her face, her hands trembling. The thought made my chest tighten in that peculiar way that comes with knowing justice is imminent. But I didn't stop there. I knew that taking legal control back wouldn't be enough to puncture the smugness Lindsay had built. I needed a psychological sting, the kind that cut deeper than paperwork. So I made an anonymous tip to the parking enforcement office about the new registration and unpaid citations, enough to trigger a compliance check. Then I called the insurance company, under the guise of confirming policy coverage, knowing the irregularities would flag their account. Little by little, I was turning the system into a maze that Lindsay and David could not escape. By Sunday night, I sat back in my chair and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. They had no idea. The storm was building, silent and methodical, and I was its architect. When the first notice hit their mailbox, it wouldn't just rattle them, it would shatter the illusion of "we're a team now" that they so arrogantly clung to. And the worst part for them was that I hadn't even shown my hand fully. The first wave was just the appetizer. What was coming next would make them regret ever thinking a borrowed car could be theirs to claim. Because I didn't just want the car back, I wanted them to understand, viscerally, that you can't steal what's mine. And the deeper the betrayal, the sweeter the inevitability of its unraveling. Monday morning, the mail arrived like a loaded gun. I watched from my car a few blocks away as Lindsay retrieved it. Her hands shook before she even opened the first envelope, her brow furrowed in confusion. I stayed quiet, heart hammering, feeling the first taste of vindication, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. The first letter was from the DMV, A notice that the registration of my Honda was under review due to discrepancies in ownership and insurance lapses. The second was from the insurance company, flagged for irregularities and requiring immediate clarification. Then came a third, the kicker, a parking citation backlog that had accrued silently over the week, addressed to her name. Her face went pale, and I could see David hovering behind her, trying to read over her shoulder. What is this?" Lindsay hissed, her voice trembling. She slammed the letters on the counter like it would erase them. They can't do this," David muttered, glancing at her, clearly shaken. "They can, and they did," I said, stepping up to the front door. My voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of calculated fury. "Everything you did to my car, everything you tried to rewrite, every corner you cut, you're going to deal with it now. Legally, formally, officially." Lindsay's eyes narrowed, a flicker of fury replacing the panic. You can't. You gave it to us, she shrieked. I didn't answer. Instead, I handed her the DMV notice I had also requested in person. The one showing that the vehicle's registration had been flagged, frozen, and temporarily reverted to me pending investigation. The legal paper was crisp, unassailable. She glanced at it and froze, realization dawning. But then came the twist that even I hadn't fully anticipated. A call from the DMV clerk while I was watching them argue. "Ma'am, it appears there's been a simultaneous submission by your daughter-in-law transferring ownership. Normally, this would be a problem, but our system flagged it because of the insurance and registration lapses. If it weren't for you, we would have completed the transfer in their favor." I blinked. I hadn't expected that the DMV would essentially validate my ownership temporarily while investigating their missteps. It was more than I could have hoped for. It was a slam dunk. In that moment, the power balance shifted entirely. Lindsay's smug confidence dissolved, replaced by terror. She backed away from me, eyes wide, muttering, "This isn't fair. How this isn't fair." David, for the first time in years, didn't speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish, no words forming. I realized then that he hadn't been the mastermind. He had been a pawn, manipulated by Lindsay's relentless confidence. The irony strung sweetly. And just as I was about to leave, feeling the first flush of real victory, Lindsay did something desperate. She grabbed the letters, crumpled them, and started ripping them to pieces. I froze. That was when I realized she was trying to destroy evidence. It was reckless, impulsive, and in her panic, exactly the misstep I needed for the next phase. I calmly reached over and took the remaining shredded pieces from her hand. Each tear she had made could be pieced back together. Each shred was now part of the trail that would prove every illegal transfer, every lie, and every claim she made about ownership. Lindsay sank to the floor in tears, realizing that in trying to erase the problem, she had only cemented it. David sat beside her, silent, finally seeing the severity of what his wife had engineered. I walked away slowly, keeping my composure, but inside, a dark satisfaction bloomed. They had underestimated me. They had thought this was a simple matter of persuasion and assumption. They hadn't realized that I had patience, memory, and a system behind every move. And as I drove away, the first real domino had fallen. But what they didn't know, the real twist I hadn't revealed yet, was that the storm wasn't just legal. The next wave would be personal, humiliating, and devastating. After that first wave of letters, I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I knew Lindsay's tears were temporary, and David's stunned silence wasn't remorse, it was shock. Shock fades and smugness creeps back in. I needed a plan that would hit harder, where the consequences weren't just legal. They would cut into their sense of control, their pride, their illusion of teamwork. I spent that night outlining every detail. I made a list of every lie Lindsay had told to manipulate David, every subtle slight she had thrown at me over the years, and every opportunity she had taken for granted. The more I wrote, the more the pattern emerged. This wasn't about a car. It was about domination, and domination could be dismantled piece by piece. The first step was leverage. I had legal ownership of the Honda again, temporarily frozen in my name, but the psychological leverage wasn't enough. I needed them to understand that what they thought was theirs could be taken, and that no one could protect them from the consequences of their choices. I started digging deeper. I checked online filings, small claims, and even property records. There were gaps Lindsay had left open, little oversights, that only someone who meticulously tracked every move would notice, and I noticed them. Next, I focused on timing. I wanted the retaliation to hit simultaneously, with precision. Letters alone were a first wave, but I needed a second strike that was unavoidable, public, and personal. I planned to expose their fraudulent ownership to every office and company that could amplify its impact. The DMV, the insurance company, the city parking department, and even the title insurance office. Every notification would reinforce the first one, making it impossible for them to ignore or spin the story in their favor. I also thought about the emotional angle. David was complicit, yes, but Lindsay had been the architect. I wanted her to feel the collapse of control in real time. I mapped out scenarios of her opening envelopes, talking to clerks, realizing that she couldn't undo her own mistakes. Every shred of paper she thought she destroyed could be reconstructed and sent back to her. Every lie she had told to justify her actions would now be documented and undeniable. Then I considered their friends and social circles. Lindsay loves the image of perfection, the well-mannered wife, the clever partner, the woman who always wins. If I could quietly expose her manipulation to her social sphere, the humiliation would be complete. I made a mental list, subtle hints, verifiable facts, and carefully worded notices that didn't break any law but made it impossible for her to spin her narrative without losing credibility. Finally, I scheduled my moves like a chess master. Monday, letters and DMV notifications. Wednesday, insurance follow-ups and citations. Friday, a final consolidated packet showing all of her errors. Mailed to her home and to David's work. Each step calculated, each domino set to fall. And if they tried to fight back, the trail I had created would make them look reckless, negligent, and dishonest, exactly the reversal I needed. I leaned back in my chair that night, exhausted but energized. Revenge isn't about rage, it's about patience, precision, and timing. I felt the anticipation rise in my chest, the way it tightens just before the storm breaks. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that this was more than a car or a legal technicality. This was a statement. You cannot manipulate me, you cannot erase what belongs to me, and you cannot underestimate the quiet fury of someone who has been wronged. And when the storm finally hit, they would understand in every way possible. Friday morning arrived, cold and bright, and I felt the weight of anticipation heavier than ever. By now, Lindsay and David had begun to recover from the initial shock of the letters, but that recovery was a trap. They thought they were regaining control, that they could smooth things over with DMV clerks or the insurance company. They didn't know the real storm was about to hit. I started with the mail. Every envelope contained meticulously compiled documentation, DMV notices, insurance discrepancies, parking citations, and proof of her attempted paper shredding. But the second twist wasn't in the letters themselves. It was in what I did next. I had discovered that Lindsay, in her rush to claim the car, had forged one signature, a minor one, a seemingly innocuous forgery on the title transfer. It wasn't something most people would notice, but I did, and it was legally damning. With a few phone calls and official submissions, I flagged it with the state's vehicle department. Now, not only was the registration temporarily reverted to me, but an official investigation was opened into potential fraud. By lunchtime, I knew it was working. I called a trusted DMV clerk I had befriended years ago, someone who knew how to confirm the flags quietly. Everything being reviewed, she said, and the investigation notice just went out to the registered owner. I imagined Lindsay opening the letter. Her smug confidence, the kind that had tormented me for years, would crumble. And David, he would see the reality that being part of her team meant being complicit in a legal mess he had never wanted. But the real shock came when I took it one step further. I sent copies of the investigation notice and documentation of her attempted forgery to her workplace, not in a malicious sense, just factual official notices. Suddenly, her perfectly curated image began to fracture. Colleagues would ask questions, and she would have no ready answers. The car wasn't just a car anymore. It was a symbol of her recklessness, her manipulation, her audacity to think she could rewrite reality without consequences. By mid-afternoon, the house was chaos. I drove past and saw Lindsay packing, phone glued to her ear, voice rising in panic. David was sitting at the kitchen table, head in his hands, muttering, I didn't know, over and over. They were unraveling before my eyes. And then came the part that no one, not even I, had fully anticipated, but I had predicted it in a subtle, hidden way. Their neighbors, curious about the flurry of official-looking envelopes piling up, had started asking questions. Lindsay, in her desperation, tried to explain them away, but the stack of letters, citations, and notices painted a very different picture. Their perfect image of domestic bliss, of a team in sync with each other and their community, was now publicly crumbling. I watched from a distance as Lindsay sank to the floor, crying, her hands covering her face. David remained frozen, silent, finally realizing how much he had underestimated the consequences of siding with her. It wasn't just a legal problem anymore, it was social, emotional, and deeply personal. And that's when I realized something crucial. The second twist wasn't just about legal leverage. It wasn't even about humiliation. It was about revelation. Lindsay had spent years convincing everyone she was clever, untouchable. The letters, the citations, the investigations, they shattered that illusion. She was exposed in every sense. By the time I drove away, I knew the final phase was coming. This wasn't over. Lindsay had been weakened, David shaken, and my position was untouchable. But the real satisfaction, the kind that leaves someone speechless and regretful, was still ahead. I just had to wait for the perfect moment. I never planned for this to just be about a car. The car was the spark, yes, but the fire had been building for years. Every time Lindsay smiled her clever, condescending smile, every time David parroted her manipulations, every time they rewrote reality to make me seem petty or unreasonable, it all added up. That Honda was the perfect symbol, something I had earned, something I had protected, something they thought they could just claim. It became more than a car. It became the embodiment of every slight, every betrayal, every moment I had been dismissed as overreacting or old-fashioned. As I drove that Friday evening, I replayed everything in my mind. The lies Lindsay had spun, the gaslighting, the way she convinced David to side with her over me. I wasn't just punishing her for the car. I was exposing the truth she had buried under charm and manipulation for years. And the dramatic reason for my revenge wasn't simply satisfaction, it was justice. Real, undeniable, inescapable justice. I knew the final act had to be irreversible. I couldn't just reclaim the Honda or make them pay small fines. It had to be a moment that would leave them reeling, one that cut through their arrogance and forced them to confront the reality they had tried so desperately to control. I returned to the DMV one last time to finalize the official transfer back into my name permanently. This time I requested the paperwork be mailed directly to their home, not mine, so they would experience the shock firsthand. Every form, every signature, every stamp of official authority now screamed my victory. The car wasn't just mine, it was untouchable. But the deeper layer, the part they would never see coming, was personal. I had compiled a complete dossier of their actions, the lies, the forged signatures, the manipulations. I sent copies to Lindsay's workplace HR and to David's office, framed as official correspondence regarding legal compliance issues. Not a single word was fabricated, not a single fact was omitted. Yet when she opened it, she was confronted with a meticulously documented narrative that proved beyond any doubt how she had tried to rewrite reality at my expense. I imagined her hands shaking as she read the documentation, the cold realization that she couldn't explain this away, couldn't manipulate anyone's perception. The power she had wielded for years over everyone, including David, evaporated in a single moment. David, finally seeing the full scope, understood how complicit he had been and how easily he had been manipulated. And the cruel irony, the final stroke, was that I didn't have to yell, argue, or even face them in person. The system had done my work. The legal letters, the citations, the notifications, they were all formal, official, unassailable. And yet every bit of this punishment was personal, intimate, and devastating. I didn't just reclaim the car, I reclaimed my authority, my dignity, my respect. When Lindsay finally broke down into uncontrollable tears, it wasn't because I had taken the car back. It was because everything she had built her identity on, the cleverness, the control, the ability to manipulate those closest to her, had been stripped away in one perfectly orchestrated reveal. And David, silent, sat beside her, understanding for the first time that teamwork with her had been a trap. I left them that evening knowing that nothing would ever be the same. The Honda was back in my possession, yes, but more importantly, the illusion of invincibility Lindsay had carried for years was gone, and that in the end was the most satisfying victory of all. The last time I saw Lindsay, she didn't look like the same person. There was no confidence, no smugness, no carefully crafted composure, just exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones when everything you thought you controlled slips through your fingers all at once. It happened 3 days after the final paperwork was delivered. I was at home when I heard a knock on my door, slow, hesitant, almost fragile. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Lindsay stood there, eyes red, face pale, clutching a folder so tightly her knuckles were white. David stood a few steps behind her, not meeting my eyes. That alone told me everything I needed to know. She didn't speak at first, she just held out the folder. Inside were copies of everything I had sent, the DMV rulings, the fraud investigation notice, the insurance flags, the citations. Every single piece of the system I had turned against her was sitting there in one place, undeniable. I didn't think it would go this far, she finally said, her voice breaking. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since this started. You didn't think I'd fight back, I said, calm and steady. David shifted behind her. Mom, we can fix this, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He sounded like someone trying to convince himself more than me. I shook my head. No, you can't fix what you already broke. And that's when the final piece fell into place. What they didn't know, what I had kept to myself this entire time, was that I had already filed the final report with the state regarding the forged signature. Not just flagged, filed. The investigation wasn't just pending anymore, it was active, and once it crossed that line, it couldn't simply be taken back or smoothed over with apologies. Lindsay's eyes widened as I told her. I watched the exact moment it hit her, the understanding that this wasn't a family disagreement anymore. This was official, permanent, recorded. You reported it, she whispered. I documented what you did, I corrected. You reported yourself the moment you signed my name. She broke then, not controlled tears, not the kind she could weaponize, real, uncontrollable sobbing. The kind that comes when there's no version of the story left to twist in your favor. David finally stepped forward, anger flashing for the first time, but it wasn't at me, it was at her. You told me it was fine, he said, his voice low and shaking. You said she gave it to us, you said it was handled. Lindsay couldn't even respond, she just shook her head, collapsing in on herself. And in that moment, I saw it clearly. The team was gone, completely. Whatever illusion they had built together had shattered under the weight of truth and consequences. I didn't yell, I didn't gloat, I just stepped aside and opened the door wider. Take your papers, I said, you'll need them. They left without another word. A week later I got confirmation. The investigation had concluded. Penalties were issued. Fines, legal marks on record, nothing life-ending, but enough to follow Lindsay for years. Enough that every time she tried to sign something official, apply for anything serious, or claim control over someone else's property, there would be a shadow behind her name. And David, he moved out not long after. I didn't hear it from him, I heard it from a mutual acquaintance. Apparently, the team didn't survive the truth. As for the car, I got it back in its original condition, or as close as possible. I had it repainted, restored, and re-registered fully in my name. The first time I drove it again, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that it was mine, not just legally, but undeniably. But the real revenge wasn't the car. It was the silence that followed. No more smug remarks, no more subtle manipulations, no more rewriting reality, just distance, just consequences, just the undeniable understanding that I was not someone they could take from and walk away unscathed. Lindsay thought she could take something from me and force me to accept it. She thought I'd stay quiet to keep the peace. Instead, I took everything she relied on, her control, her narrative, her image, and I let the truth dismantle it piece by piece. And the last thing I ever heard about her was simple. She cries whenever my name comes up.